Hello, everyone. My name is Madeline Hoffman, and I'm a host, a regular host on KRTD Productions. This is a special program today, one that we spoke about last Friday. I co-host the second Friday of every month, along with Shane Coughlin. So we did a story in anticipation of the elections in Ecuador, the runoff elections in Ecuador, elections that took place yesterday, Sunday, April 11th. And we said we would have a show to respond to what happened in those elections. And so here we are. Today, we are fortunate, lucky to be joined by two members of the Young Eco-Socialists in New Jersey. We have Matthew Skolar, who's the chair of the Young Eco-Socialists in New Jersey, and Anthony Samaniego, who's chair of the Peace Committee of the Young Eco-Socialists of New Jersey, and then also a member of the Green Party of the United States, Peace Action Committee, or GPACs. And Anthony is also Ecuadorian American, and so he has a lot to say about the results. He had a lot to say about the elections when they happened, and has had a lot to say ever since. And we welcome his comments on what transpired in Ecuador last night. And once he's given his assessment of what happened or his reactions to what happened, then we're going to have a conversation about what he has said and what we all think about what happened last night. So Anthony, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Madeline. So, as you introduced me, I am Ecuadorian American, and I have been paying close attention to the elections. And some of you may or may not know that this was actually the second round of votes, because the Ecuadorian elections take place in February. So there was a recount of the votes demanded. And initially, the socialist candidate, Andrés Arauz, of the Unión de la Esperanza party, was extremely popular since the beginning and was the initial victor of the first round of elections. He won by about 32% and by about a few thousand more votes than Guillermo Lasso, his opponent. And in this second round of elections, as you can see, Guillermo Lasso is the victor and now the president-elect of Ecuador. He won by 52.51%, which is, I believe, 10% higher than Andrés Arauz, which he won by 47.49%. So, us having our beliefs and of socialism and progressivism and our anti-imperialist beliefs, I was disappointed in the results, obviously. And about yesterday, when I knew that Andrés Arauz lost, I initially thought, well, I am disappointed, but I hope good things can happen to Ecuador, and I hope that Guillermo Lasso can do good things for my country, Ecuador. And I started having a few doubts, but I then thought that maybe I was just wrong, or maybe I was just overreacting. And today, as I spoke with Madeline today and Matthew, I saw in Guillermo Lasso's Twitter account, he immediately got applauded and recognized by right-wing regimes in Latin America, most notably those of Chile, Brazil, and Colombia. And he also immediately got recognized and applauded by the Western US-backed and European-backed Venezuelan opposition leader, Juan Guaido, who has insistently imposed that he is the president of his country and has the immediate backing of the United States and Europe. So, which brings me to my next point. I then started having my doubts of the results of the Ecuadorian election. And first of all, is because this entire time during the elections and during both leaders' campaign process, there has been interference by the US-backed Organization of American States, most notably by the Colombian government, and with representatives and backing of the US government from both the Trump and Biden administrations. There have been secret meetings with Guillermo Lasso, with US representatives in the White House, and they had plans to demonize Andres Arauz's campaign, to illegitimize his campaign in order to prevent him from running, or in order to cause his defeat. And because of this, I have my suspicions that, though I hope I am wrong, but I still strongly suspect that these results have something to do with interference, the interference, as I said, was already going on by the United States, the Organization of American States. I also fear, and that with Guillermo Lasso in power in Ecuador, that Ecuador will continue to be a base, will continue to be in the hands of North American imperialism. There have been talks with the current government and also Guillermo Lasso's representatives of bringing back the US military presence in Manta, a province in Ecuador, which was kicked out by late socialist president Rafael Correa when he was in power. His ideology, his progressive ideology, is known as Correísmo, and Andrés Arauz wanted to bring back his ideology of Correísmo and wanted to bring back progress to working people in Ecuador, oppressed groups such as indigenous peoples in Ecuador, or Black people, or a mix of indigenous and Black people in Ecuador. He also wanted to, Andrés Arauz wanted to take away Ecuador from the hands of the International Monetary Fund, which essentially has representatives, big bankers in Ecuador, which take away most of the funds from the country and do large businesses over the land of indigenous peoples. They essentially, what you would consider, exploit the resources of the country. And they have also taken away the money from the education, from the colleges, from the Ecuadorian students. Now, my next point is that, though, and this is actually something that relieved me a little bit, is that, so even with Andrés Arauz's defeat, his party has the most representatives in the Ecuadorian National Assembly. So Andrés Arauz, after accepting defeat, has announced that he will continue to form and organize an opposition against the current government in power, against the current neoliberal and neoconservative government in power. He will use the National Assembly to continue organizing and continue to advocate for social justice in the country. Thank you.
Yeah, Anthony, thank you. And when we were talking earlier today, that last point you made about the numbers of members of Arauz's party who are in the Ecuadorian Assembly, that gave me some hope, because I too, well, we were watching, people in the United States, people in Canada, people around the world were watching these elections with interest, a lot of interest, and also, to be sure, or to make sure, if we could, that there were no irregularities that took place. And so it was kind of a surprise that the results turned out the way they did. It seemed likely up until just recently, even, that Arauz was ahead in the polls. And there were some question marks about polling organizations saying things and letting people in Ecuador, pushing the results in a particular direction. But we see now that it's when people like Juan Guaido congratulate Lasso, and when people, in Colombia congratulate him, it just kind of shows the breakdown of power in Latin America at this point. And I wanted to ask you and Matthew also, how should, what look, there's still power from, Arauz and Correa in Ecuador? How do people maximize that power? What happens from here? What do you think should happen, could happen, needs to happen from here? And I ask Matthew as well as Anthony.
Matthew, do you have anything to say? Just in case I want to give you the chance.
Well, Arauz's party has the majority of seats, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to speak too much on it, but I would say that, obviously if Arauz's party has the most amount of seats in parliament, they're going to be the ones that, can actively oppose Lasso. Where I think, like, from the international side of things, in terms of like the solidarity that we can show with Belarus's party is, it's really important that we just watch and make sure that Ecuadorian leaders are able to actively oppose Lasso and aren't interfered with in doing so by foreign governments, because it wouldn't surprise me at all, based off what we've seen in Venezuela, based off what we've seen in Bolivia and in other countries throughout history, but especially in recent years in Latin America. It wouldn't shock me to see the United States go in there and try to, play some games, not fun games.
No, not fun and games, not at all. Yeah. Your reaction, Anthony?
So yeah, well, first of all, I obviously completely agree with Matthew, and that's a point that I didn't even think of, that I probably should have thought of, was the solidarity, the international solidarity, especially. I look forward to sympathy coming from, say, the Bolivarian movements, which I thought Ecuador would have joined if I'd also won, but I guess not at the moment. But I desire solidarity and sympathy from the Bolivarian countries like Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Argentina, and Cuba. And I also wish that, like, now, and based on my knowledge on behalf of those countries, their form of, like, sort of intervention is sending either medical missions or some sort of humanitarian aid. That's something that I definitely wish from those countries, in solidarity with the Ecuadorian people. Based on my knowledge, since, again, Andres Arauz's party, Unión por la Esperanza, has the majority of representatives in the National Assembly, they have the power to pass laws or to deny Lasso one of his proposed bills. So that's also something that I look forward to. Like, if Lasso has a law that could deeply harm and affect the Ecuadorian people, or if Lasso has any plans to cause any sort of suffering, long-term suffering for the Ecuadorian people, that the National Assembly in Ecuador could advocate and could prevent Lasso from passing such laws, such policies.
Anthony, could you give us an example of one big difference between Lasso and Arauz, and what the people of Ecuador would be looking out for? A difference between neoliberalism, I guess, and socialism. But can you give us a specific policy you think that might result in a pushback from the assembly, or that should result in a pushback from the assembly?
Yes. So obviously, the main difference between Socialist Arauz and a neoliberal, or I should say actually neoconservative, from Guillermo Lasso, is Guillermo Lasso would pretty much continue the same policies of the current Moreno government. He would continue to work closely with the International Monetary Fund. Like, even with an opposition in the National Assembly, the International Monetary Fund would have extreme power in Ecuador, and so would what we know as USAID. They would work very closely. And I also, as we spoke earlier, Marilyn, today, is that Guillermo Lasso, just like the Moreno government, continues to allow the presence of U.S. military in the country. Like, there's already a U.S. air base that about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago was put in place in the Galapagos Islands, which would be essentially a strategic area for the United States, having a U.S. air base over there. And essentially, by allowing U.S. military presence to gain hegemony and control in Ecuador, that would bring in a lot of pollution in any part of Ecuador, especially in the Galapagos Islands. It would bring pollution to like a lot of natural habitats over there, because the Galapagos Islands is protected by UNESCO. It's recognized by UNESCO as a world tourist site, as a natural world location. And yes, there would definitely be a lot of like the so-called war on drugs would expand in Ecuador. There'd be a lot of like U.S. backed training of Ecuadorian law enforcement, which would be very active in rural areas or oppressed areas. It would be very active in indigenous areas. So yeah, those I believe, which and obviously I would have to see what happens, but those I believe are the big differences between Guillermo Lasso and Andres Arauz. Those I believe would be the policies of Guillermo Lasso and his government once they take power.
Did you say too that there was a concern that the military base on the Galapagos Islands could be used for some kind of military action or exercise against Venezuela? You say that
Yes.
to me earlier today. Yeah.
Yes, most definitely. That's something that wasn't even a secret at the time when President Lenin Moreno met with both Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo, and you know they would talk about like that the U.S. airfield would be to combat narcotics, but it would also be a strategic point to, in their eyes, act with humanitarianism or act with spreading democracy by acting in military action against Venezuela. If the worst case scenario, there would be a military action against Venezuela, the U.S. airfield in the Galapagos Islands would be a key launching pad.
Is there a difference in the position of Arauz versus Correa, not Correa, versus Lasso on whether or not to be part of such an action? Whether Ecuador should be part of such an action? Yeah.
Yeah, so since Arauz, he was a minister of late socialist president Rafael Correa. And as I mentioned before, that Correa, when he was in power, he was part of the Bolivarian movement. So he aligned himself with Venezuela and Cuba, and he like other socialist leaders we know today in Latin America or in other parts of the world. Both Correa and Arauz are strongly opposed to having any sort of foreign military presence in Ecuador, and Arauz and both Correa and Arauz strongly believe in respecting the sovereignty of other nations, whatever nation that may be. So now, in the case of Guillermo Lasso, since we know that he immediately got applauded by Juan Guaido, Guillermo Lasso responded in Twitter by saying that Ecuador will assist the Venezuelan people to regain democracy. So, like that, I guess that would be Guillermo Lasso's version of trying to set up a democratic process in Venezuela, one that supposedly doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, this is how socialism and socialist leaders are genuinely misportrayed by the U.S. and U.S. media. Matthew.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if you've been following the Peruvian elections. They've also been happening at the same time, and they just had their first round. And I believe the leftist candidate there is leading in Peru, but not enough to outright win. So that's probably going to go to a second round now also. And I'm wondering, do you think the same things might happen in Peru that we just saw in Ecuador? And like where do we go like from here? Obviously there's a leftist movement in Ecuador and Peru. But what happens if both those countries, their parliaments are to the left and then their president is not?
Anthony, you have an answer?
So yeah, so essentially my same position as Ecuador, since their president-elect will not be on the left, but their National Assembly will. At the moment, the country will not officially, in the case of Peru and Colombia, if that happens, those countries will obviously not be part of the Bolivarian movement, and they obviously will continue the coalition of aggression against Venezuela or Cuba. But there'll definitely be a difference in those countries if their National Assembly or their parliament is on the left, then there will be a difference in the laws that will be in place or the laws that will be passed. There'll be a difference in policies, like maybe the non-leftist president will impose its policies, but it won't be able to impose all his policies at once. And I definitely I can assure that, like, with a non-leftist president, a right-wing president, and a left National Assembly, left Parliament, there will be definitely there'll be failures on behalf of that president, and any attempt that the president wants to do in that country, any anti-democratic attempt or any attempt to silence any sort of organizing or advocacy, will most probably end up in failure with a leftist parliament.
Well, that really did give me some hope earlier today when you and I spoke about that, because elections aren't the only way that people show, what they really want, and it isn't the only way to accomplish change. And the fact that there's still a strong movement to the left within the assembly, the National Assembly, gives me hope. I know also that there are elections coming up in Honduras in November, and there is a people's candidate running for office in Honduras as well, one who is the wife, Xiomara Castro. She's the wife of Manuel Castro, who was deposed by the U.S. Going back a ways. So, people in Latin America are resilient too, and they're going to keep fighting. But we also talked about this because in Peru there were 16 candidates for the presidency, and it's hard for any one of 16 to get the required number of votes to win outright. Is there some other kind of elections holding a different form or style of elections that would help to prevent this kind of, we have one election. And in this one, it was also the one in Ecuador that Lasso just barely squeezed past the indigenous candidate. And so, it really surprises me that he went from almost losing, not being the person who was going to be in the runoff, to one who not only was in the runoff, but won in the runoff. Yeah, and so we talked a little bit about this, Anthony, something where people could rank their choices. And what would you think? What would that be something that could apply in Ecuador or Peru? Because once it gets narrowed down to two candidates, we don't know often what's going on behind the scenes.
Yes, I couldn't agree any further. Like, definitely ranked choice voting would help. Of course, going back again to parliamentary or National Assembly, like the elections of National Assembly or the parliament would definitely help, because like, as we saw in Venezuela, that in November, I believe that the Socialist Party of Maduro, they won in the parliamentary election, so they retook it from the opposition. So those are two strategies that I know of that would help at the moment. And another thing I have to say is, yeah, like, I spoke to you earlier, Madeline, and I was very surprised. I'm still very surprised at Lasso's victory. Like, I honestly don't know how it became possible. Like, I really do hope that it was fair and square, or like, I still really fear that this was some sort of CIA attempt, because as we spoke, like, this is something very similar that we see in history when the results don't come out the way as expected, the way the people would have expected when you see a progressive candidate get defeated by a neoliberal or conservative candidate, right wing candidate. It was due to some sort of CIA meddling in the election. So that's something that I still strongly, maybe not strongly because I don't currently have any evidence, but I still think probably happened. And that's something that I still have my doubts on Lasso's victory.
You mean the US medals in elections of other countries? You've got to be kidding me, Anthony.
It's very surprising.
Meddles with its own elections.
How do you mean, Matthew?
I mean, when has a green ever been able to win on a national scale?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just, playing around a little bit here, but the other thing that I was reading about in this election, and then we maybe move on to some of the impacts for the rest of of Latin America, but I was reading that the race between Perez and Lasso was so close. It was, a slice of a percentage point. It wasn't even a percentage point, it was about maybe a third of a percentage point difference between the two. And Perez asked for a recount to make sure that he was the one that Lasso was the one who was victorious. And apparently there was no recount. And because there was no recount or no satisfactory recount, then Perez told his or recommended to his supporters to spoil their ballots, to not participate. Apparently there was something like 16% of the vote that wasn't cast or counted because the ballots were spoiled. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, something that I didn't hear, but like I completely believe you, Madeline. One thing that I did hear was that like there were statistics that shown that at one point there was a tie between the two candidates. There was a tie of votes, but during that point we were watching, as you can see in the picture, that Guillermo Lasso still outranked Arauz, even though like there were hidden statistics that show that there was a tie in the vote, and then from there wasn't any update between like who rose in votes, who rose in popularity. So that's one thing I am aware of.
Yeah, well, we know how that goes. The exit polls, when exit polls in the US are announced too early or were announced too early, it sways the rest of the votes. And there was a discussion about keeping all of those predictions under wraps until after the elections were over, so as not to skew or influence it. It's so hard. It's really so hard to monitor from afar what's going on with elections. But yeah, I guess the US has some history in meddling in the overseas elections, and then meddling in its own elections, as Matthew said. And we have to watch Honduras too. That's coming up. And Peru, when is I guess it would be another couple of months before the runoff election takes place there. So what do you both think, or what do we think about what the impact of this is going to be on Latin America and other Latin American elections?
So personally, I think, as you said, Marilyn, that definitely many people around the world are watching this election. So in Latin America, if people have the same doubts as me, I'm not surprised if other people in other countries have the same doubts as me. But if they do, then they will try to organize their movement even more. They're gonna have the same determination, I guess, as the Bolivian people when they had their elections. Like I heard people in Bolivia that they would block roads and do other stuff. So they might have that same determination, that same more passion in Peru or in Colombia or Bolivia to prevent the same similar results as the election in Ecuador. And that's also one thing. Speaking about determination, I'm like in the moment when I was watching the updated results and I see Lasso winning, I'm like, what's going on? Like I'm like, maybe on behalf of Andres Arauz's side, there wasn't a hard enough fight. Like I don't know what was going on at the moment. that's what I was thinking. Maybe there wasn't a hard enough fight.
So anybody who believes in the people's candidates and people who believe in socialism in Latin American countries are going to have to fight like you know what in order to win. What's the role Colombia played in all this? Because I know I have quite a few contacts in Colombia, and they're preparing for their elections in next year, 2022, and one of my friends posted something last night which prompted me to take a look at the results. She said, this is something that what's happening here in Ecuador is likely going to happen in Colombia too in 2022. What was the role that Colombia played in this? The Colombian government, anyway.
Yes. So essentially, as like I said, there were meetings in the White House with both U.S. and Colombian representatives and representatives from Guillermo Lasso. Obviously, there was that overwhelming moral support towards Lasso on behalf of both the Colombian and the U.S. government. There was a lot of financial support as well, and together with the Colombian representatives and Guillermo Lasso's representatives and representatives from the U.S., they planned all these accusations. As I told you, Madeline, when we spoke, there was a ton of accusations towards Andres Arauz's campaign. From the beginning, since he had his campaign, there were attempts to demonize his campaign and prevent him from running. There was already an attempt from the Ecuadorian government, from Moreno, to prevent Andres Arauz's campaign from running by preventing his party from running. So he had to create a smaller party, a smaller version of the Unión de la Esperanza, which was a lesser known version to the Ecuadorian people. That was already something that he struggled with. And then there was the accusation that he was registered in Mexico and not in Ecuador so he can cast his vote. But there wasn't any like valid evidence presented. That was just an accusation. That was just an accusation on the Ecuadorian media. There was the accusation of Andres Arauz conspiring and working with Colombian guerrillas in Ecuador. Like that's it. That's a typical accusation on any socialist leader, whether they're president or not. Same Maduro gets accused of the same things, and Evo Morales gets accused of the same things. But yeah, there was a supposed video of Colombian guerrillas confessing of working with Arauz, but like when I looked at the details closely, like at one point that scared me because at one point I believed it, but looking at the details closely, that was a very not well known guerrilla group that was said to be, and that the armaments, the weapons that they had in that video were weapons that guerrilla group doesn't use at all. And then I don't remember the name of the guerrilla leader that was accused, but the guerrilla leader that was accused of working with Andres Arauz was killed 2 weeks before Andres Arauz announced his campaign. So that was definitely all those accusations and all those attempts of demonizing his campaign and preventing him from running, or all those attempts of making Andres Arauz look corrupt and evil, was definitely planned by both the Colombian and Ecuadorian government working closely together. And of course, the US government. Surprise.
And talk about corruption. Talk about corruption. Let's talk a little bit about the corruption in other countries and in our own. I don't know if you have anything you want to share on that, Matthew or Anthony, because what happens in Ecuador, as my Colombian friend said, it could signal what's going to happen in other Latin American countries, or on the other hand, it could spur people on to fight even harder. But we really have to be. Let's look at the whole issue of corruption, because that made that I wasn't really laughing, because corruption is rampant throughout all of our governments. Yeah.
Matthew, do you have anything to say?
I mean, I don't know if I'm like the best person to really like speak on like the issues in Ecuador, but like I mean I would generally say that like in terms of US meddling in elections and the corruption that like, I mean, it's no coincidence that a lot of the corruption happens in a lot of these countries, and it's not really the people's fault. It's really, you know, the United States puts people in power, and it changes election results or influences them in a certain way to benefit corporate interests in these countries. Um, they're the U.S. has economic interests in exploiting the global South. I mean, it's not just a Latin American issue. I mean, the U.S. also meddles in the Caribbean and Haiti. The U.S. meddles on the African continent, meddles in Asia. Um, I think really we need to be looking at Arauz's defeat, not like it's an isolated incident. I mean, it's obviously there's a pattern, and I would also say that in terms of like what we as socialists should be doing, I think we should be just weary of, you know, where is the U.S. playing its role here, right? I mean, we need to be very careful about you know, protecting our movements from U.S. aggression, and I think I think out of this election, because Arauz's party still has some power, it's not a complete loss. Um, I think that, you know, Ecuador still shows a lot of promise in um, having such strong support for Arauz. It's not like it was a blowout, right? And I mean, if you want to talk about like Yaku Perez's support, who Yaku Perez, he's still struck from the left in many ways, although not to the same extent that Arauz did. Um, Yaku Perez's support is an indication that there is a larger support for the left wing in Ecuador. It's just they had two candidates put up, I think, purposely to divide the left wing vote, and that's the unfortunate thing is we have to keep we have to keep our movements united and put together.
So I would like to expand off of that. Thank you, Matthew. So, like you said, Madeline, let's talk about corruption. Both Lasso and Moreno are very close to U.S. interests in U.S. corporate companies in Ecuador, and they definitely work together with those interests. And when you look at those interests closely, they're very corrupt. They're very secretly involved with drug trafficking, as we both know that now. Again, relating to Colombia, being close to the Colombian government, they also have a history of having paramilitary groups, and those same paramilitary military groups being involved in drug trafficking. They're tied to the Colombian state. And again, now them being close to the Venezuelan opposition, they're all connected. So the Venezuelan opposition, the Colombian government, U.S. government, the Ecuadorian government, Lasso, Moreno, and U.S. interests, they're all connected. They all work together on pretty much everything. And then when you look at the facts closely, again, they are the ones involved in drug trafficking. But despite this, they still get massive financial support and promotion from U.S. media and from Ecuadorian media. They get massive support from the European powers, from the European Union. So, yeah, talk about corruption. And the Colombian government in itself, many of their close paramilitary allies have entered Ecuador. So they also work closely together with Lasso and Moreno.
Well, and some 6,400 social leaders, social community, environmental leaders in Colombia have been assassinated over the last couple of years and the last few years. And the peace accords that were negotiated with FARC, the ex-FARC, and other groups within Colombia over an 8 or 9 year period signed in 2016, they're now sitting on a shelf, and our president, Joe Biden, Democrat, who is not Trump, is continuing the Plan Colombia, which he, as a Democrat, not Trump, authored and was the point person on in the early 1990s. And he's urging the people of Colombia, the farmers in Colombia, to start aerial spraying of glyphosate, sorry, I was going to say it in the Spanish way, glyphosates all over again. And that part of the peace accords, part of the peace accords was to say, we'll find an alternate crop for the Colombian farmers so that the Colombian farmers don't have to use glyphosates. And that never happened. So if we're returning to Plan Colombia and aerial spraying, then we can pretty much kiss the peace accords goodbye. And I mean, I've traveled to Colombia now several times, and I'm planning to go back at the end of May into June and talk to farmers, indigenous, Afro-Colombianos, about trying to grow sustainable agriculture. And then not only to grow sustainably and organically, but to sell what they produce. And the corporate interests you talked about, Anthony and Matthew, they're right there. They're the campesinos, the indigenous, the Afro-Colombianos, right in their face, creating a very difficult situation. And so if we take on those corporations in our own countries, and we take them on, or are aware of how they're acting in Latin American countries, I love the way you connected all of the struggles together. And I guess is that where you see our resistance continuing, Anthony, and linking all those struggles together?
Yes, and absolutely. So as I mentioned, just like all the corrupt leaders and representatives of either Ecuador, Colombia, or the opposition of Venezuela, they're connected. So is the resistance and solidarity. Like, yeah. You would even see the connection between socialist, progressive, advocating in Latin America, acting in solidarity and connecting with justice for, say, Palestine, or just like there's even a historical alliance between Black liberation and Black Lives Matter movement here in America, and also align themselves with Palestine, and also align themselves with movements to respect the sovereignty of Latin America. They also align themselves with movements of hands off these countries from Latin America, like hands off on behalf of the U.S. Like you can see the alliance on connection on essentially on both sides.
Well, and Matthew mentioned Haiti.
Yes.
We had an action for Haiti in solidarity with Haiti, rather, last Wednesday. And we had a show. We spent about 20 minutes talking about Haiti last Friday night right here on KRTD Media with someone who had just returned from Haiti. And we want to talk about meddling, U.S. meddling. Moise is in Haiti, he's a dictator, right? And he's supposed to step down on February 7th, 2021. Here we are. It's what is it? It's April 12th, and he hasn't stepped down yet. And where's Joe Biden? Where are any of the State Department people saying, oh, Moise must step down, we have to end the dictatorship in Haiti? Where are they? Where are they, Anthony? Where are they, Matthew?
Yes, I also wonder, Marilyn, where is the, Trump's opponents on Haiti?
Yes. I mean, now all of a sudden, it's Biden and there's no backlash. Matthew, are you going to respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, they don't care, Madeline. I mean, I guess they do care. They want Moise in power, because if they put their guy in power, then that gives them, I guess, the ability to strike back at Cuba, to strike back at other left-wing governments in the Caribbean and Latin America. The more governments that the U.S. is able to have control over, put their puppets in, the more they're able to intimidate countries like Cuba, like Venezuela, that stand up to the U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, and even
Yes.
when we back a dictator, right, Anthony?
Yes.
Well, the U.S. doesn't care about democracy. What's democracy?
No, it's it's just another word that starts with the letter D, I suppose. Like dictatorship. Anthony, yeah, you were going to say?
Yes. First of all, yeah, again, I'm totally surprised the U.S. imperialism doesn't care about democracy. I'm surprised, but anyway, yeah, especially when it comes to Haiti, there's a historic historic opposition
Yes.
to both Cuba and Venezuela with Haiti from backing from the U.S. There's a historic we see in the dictatorship in Haiti. The same thing happened when Papa Doc was in power in Haiti, and both Baby Doc. Like for both of them, what was key to receiving massive financial support from the United States is their strong opposition to Cuba and letting Haiti being used as just another base for many aggressive attempts against Cuba.
So you mean we're consistent in our, the United States government is consistent in pursuing its interests. Doesn't matter if it's consistent in pursuing corporate interests, and dictatorships, they're not, they're just, they don't really stand in our way. Actually, they stabilize, quote unquote, stabilize a country and allow the United States to take control. Oh,
Yeah, especially
so
something that.
Well,
yeah, good.
the
Yeah,
U.S. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that, especially when it came to Juvenile Moise, like he for a long time was backed by both the White House and the Pentagon. He's someone who, like, during his campaign, no one in Haiti knew who he was. Same with Juan Guaido. No one in Venezuela knew who he was before but both of them just came out of thin air, and with strong support from the West. Juvenile Moise, again, like Juan Guaido, was brought up as a social justice leader, as some sort of environmental leader or agricultural representatives. There was all sorts of narratives backing that, but those narratives were essentially CIA backed, essentially CIA backed Haitians, I believe.
U.S. politicians, they love to talk about stability. They love to talk about order, but we always know that stability and order in pretty much every context of like the U.S. government is basically just the suppression of democracy. What the U.S. calls disorder is when socialist governments come to power and feed their people and house their people, as has happened in Cuba, And then the U.S., when those countries succeed, when they actually are able to do these things, they just throw sanction after sanction after sanction on them and make it so that their economies become stagnant and their people have to leave. It's so unfair. It really is.
And it's especially unfair for the American people too, because when you see people in the United States or in our allied countries in the UK or in France or in Australia, when people come out to protest the injustice of those countries' inequality, or they come out to protest the war actions taken on behalf of their governments, there's definitely a brutal response on behalf of these governments, on behalf of Western governments, especially when we look at the case of whistleblowers, in the case of Edward Snowden or Julian Assange. Then there's
Definitely.
mass persecutions against these leaders who expose the truths from the actions of these Western governments, and then these Western governments, of course, they care about the stability of Latin America and the third world. Of course, they totally care about democracy and if Ecuador and Venezuela is free, or if there were free and fair elections, they care about that.
No, that's for sure. So can you guys, do you want to talk a little bit about the Young Eco Socialists, who they are, what you're doing, how people watching, might connect with the Young Eco Socialists, what spurred you into existence, and how, what your main concerns are?
Sure. So the Young Eco Socialists, we are the official youth caucus of the Green Party of the United States. Anthony and I specifically, we belong to the New Jersey chapter, which is one of the largest chapters in the country, and we started really right before the pandemic, but we really built up our support through the pandemic, as a lot of young people came to realize that our politicians, they don't really um, they don't really have the solutions. They claim to have solutions, but really this pandemic has shown that there's massive amount of issues in this country. People don't have access to things, and we really been trying to address those issues and encourage political empowerment through mutual aid work, through political education, and giving people the information they need to learn about um, the elections, learn about the people in power, and really expose the massive amount of injustice in this country, um, and specifically bring people towards the Green Party as a means to oppose the people in power that continue to ignore the concerns of young people all around this country. I was attracted to the Green Party just because of the way it reacts to youth, the way it empowers youth, the way it brings youth in and asks them to contribute ideas, the way we're allowed to vote in their primaries as minors. That's something very unique to the Green Party. And I think it's something that attracts a lot of youth. I think it's a party that actually supports what we're talking about here today, and I think it's really important that youth have that voice, and we've been able to build that voice through the Young Eco Socialists. So if anybody's interested in learning more about us, we're most active on Instagram. You can follow us at young.ecosocialist.nj, or at GPUS Youth for the national account, and then we're also on Facebook. You can find us there.
Is there an age requirement there, Matthew?
Well, yeah, we are the Young Eco Socialists. That's for anybody under the age of 35 is the official cutoff. Here in New Jersey, most of us are high school and college students, but we have some older folks too.
Amazing, wise, inspirational, active youth, high school and college students. It's such so inspiring to me. As you can see, I'm not high school, college age myself, but I'm really buoyed by everything that.
21.
Thank you, Matthew. Anthony, what do you want to say about the Young Eco Socialists? And I think we're approaching 7:00, so we should probably end on the note of how people can get involved. And one thing, I'm just going to say this, and before you answer, Anthony, because I was talking to Shane about it also. There's an urgency in what you're doing, an urgency in what the Young Eco Socialists are doing. Why such a sense of urgency?
So, and I guess I'll answer that. So I could have not said anything further or better than what Matt said. And I'll say this: within the Young Eco Socialists, like there's not an issue or a case in the community or in the world that we don't cover, and there's always a space for more issues that you may think are unheard of or that you think need addressing immediately. I guess that's the pride that we take in the Young Eco Socialists. We address issues immediately. We don't wait for politicians to tell us what to do, or we're not going to wait on politicians' ideas. that's something that we look closely in the Young Eco-Socialists, what these politicians are proposing, even if they may sound progressive and they may be otherwise. And within the Young Eco-Socialists, as introduced me, Madeline, I am the chair of its Peace Committee. We have a few committees. We have the Peace Committee, the Black Issues Committee, the Latinx Issues Committees. If you feel that like that there's an issue that you want to advocate for and you want to lead, and you want to get other people to advocate for, that's the whole purpose of the committees. There's always room to open a new committee. And of course, Matt's someone that you can always reach out to for any proposed ideas. You want to chair a new committee, or you even want to open up a new spot within the Young Eco-Socialist e-board. So yeah, that's all I can say.
One last question. We just learned yesterday that the Biden administration is asking for $753 billion, a budget of $753 billion with a B dollars for the military. It's larger than what Trump asked for. It's larger than it's been in a little while. How do you two respond to that in the military, the huge amounts of military spending?
Where's the money for youth? That's my question. We have all this money for wars abroad. Where's the money for youth?
For schools. Where's the money for the schools, for houses, for say investing in arts, sports, and especially where's the money that Biden promised? I know he promised daily money.
Yeah,
Oh,
I mean,
we know why the stimulus check came down to $1,600 because, or $1,400, because clearly he wanted to go put money towards war. I guess there wasn't enough towards it.
Right, it wasn't enough to have 750 billion or 748 billion. Has to be 753 billion. And I mean, just even what we talked about so far today, in the time we had today, the interventions, the ability to meddle in the affairs of other countries, particularly in Latin America, but also Africa. There's over 800 military bases the US has all around the world. We're the only country that's got anywhere near that amount of military bases outside of our own borders. And then here we are, talking about a group of people in Ecuador who are backing a people's socialist candidate, who tried with everything they had to win this election, and finding that they're up against forces they might be able to name, but they can't really see. And I think, from our discussion today, again, as always, your voices, the voices of the youth, and the passion you have and the desire you have to see change, I think is going to carry us. It needs to carry us all. So, last words from either one of you, and any last words from you, Anthony or Matthew?
And I guess my last words are ending with a question. So as you mentioned, Marilyn, we have more than 800 bases in the world, and apparently there's never enough.
Yep. So on that note, unless you have something you want to end up with, Matthew?
No, not really.
Thank you both for being on with me, and I'll be having you on at other times as other issues come up. We'll be looking at Haiti. We'll be looking at Honduras. We'll be looking at what's happening in other parts of Latin America and around the world. And your voices are invaluable, so necessary to what we need to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us, Madeline.
Thank you.
Pleasure.